I think it's just one of those big ironies with these people is that they think they're doing what God wants, and they really aren't. They're moving themselves further away from the culture, and so they're not actually being good witnesses.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reclamation, a Be Emboldened initiative. I'm Naomi, the founder and executive director here at BE, and we exist for those who have been impacted by spiritual abuse. We provide support for the prevention of victimization as well as re-victimization, and we desire to create safe places to ask the hard questions and to really begin healing and rebuilding. Today, we're going to be talking about celebrations, kind of a philosophy of celebrations, and then getting into these specific details that some of us have, really gotten hung up on, and we've been given a lot of grief over when we talk about more specifically, say, Christmas and Easter. So I do not know anyone better to bring on for this conversation than Michael Jones. If you have not heard of Michael, he is the founder and director of the nonprofit organization Inspiring Philosophy. And he is primarily dedicated to research in the fields of philosophy, as well as history and science, to uncover deep philosophical questions relating to the universe and our individual perception of life. He has published a plethora of research work on his YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy, where he compiles and analyzes data for the layman to reach reasonable conclusions to a variety of philosophical quandaries. Some of his most notable work includes his presented research on quantum mechanics and how it points to a theistic worldview, a video series on Genesis 1 through 11, a defense of the resurrection of Jesus, and videos addressing the problem of evil and hell. So as I read that through, everyone's probably like, wait, and he's coming on to talk about holidays? But Michael is known for making the rounds. He has done some really, really deep dive research into the most original documents that we can get on these things to take us back to really give us some solid footing on how to make these decisions about if we're going to celebrate and how we're going to celebrate. So with that, Michael, I'm going to jump right into question one. And I'm wondering, throughout all of the conversations you've had about celebrating holidays, whether it's different interviews you've done, individuals you've spoken with, what are some different kind of views or philosophies maybe of celebration, of celebrating these holidays that you've run into?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different views. Everyone's going to have a various take on the whole issue. Most people that I run into, just around town or just in life in general, are perfectly fine with celebrating the holidays. They don't see any problem with it, and they don't really care where it came from. Then there are some people that believe it has some sort of pagan origin, and then they tend to say, well, it doesn't really matter because that connotation has not survived today. And then you get people that are on the extreme end and say, no, it is pagan. And because it's pagan, we need to disavow Christmas, Easter, Halloween, all these holidays because they have some sort of pagan elements in them, and that upsets God. So you get those people fall on different spectrums on that various map, I guess you could say. But most people just don't tend to care, or if it is have pagan origin, they recognize it's not a big deal. Then you get the very loud, small minority that is screaming off to the right saying, no, it's pagan and it's evil. We need to avoid it at all costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is what I fell into. And that's not uncommon for authoritarian type groups. So whether someone's, comes from a cult of Christianity like I did, or just something where it's very fire and brimstone and very works-based and those kinds of elements, I would say it's more common that I run into this question and those kinds of circles. And so I agree. I've heard this sort of mix between, it's just a fun time with family and friends. And of course, if I go more secular, I'm going to hear that. So, Christmas with family who, doesn't believe in Jesus, is going to look very different than Christmas with family who does. So I can hear that aspect solely versus it being just a piece of the celebration. Definitely it's a form of idolatry. It's it's pagan. Those issues. I remember this article I was given when I was probably like 10 or 11. I can't even remember who wrote it, but it was in connection with The Message. William Branham, who was a, quote unquote prophet at the time and inspired my upbringing. But I was given this printout from Google that I had to read about all the reasons why Christmas was pagan, and this is why we haven't been celebrating. This is why we've been doing it right. And so that was, my
Yeah, and
indoctrination. I'm really
that's
getting solidified at that time.
mm, yeah, and that's all nonsense. I looked into this extensively. There is no evidence that Christmas has pagan roots, as well as other holidays like Easter, Halloween, Valentine's Day. None of these holidays go back to paganism. So this is all modern mythology that has been sort of invented over several hundreds of years, starting with actually the Greek Orthodox Church attacking the Catholic Church, then Protestants picking up on that, and then, of course, atheists and neo-pagans today picking up on that. So, but when you study the history, there's no evidence any of this is true.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm glad we're going to get more into that. And for anyone who's listening to this later or catching it in the replay as well, please know that he's got Michael has a bunch of stuff on his YouTube channel and a bunch of other interviews he's done where he really hones in on specific holidays. So again, today we're going more big picture. We're going to hone in and give some specific examples of some of like the key, problems, supposed problems that people are concerned about. But there's a lot more out there. So we will also link some other examples if you're wanting to go more into. I mean, Michael, I think I've watched so much from you on this. So I know you go deeper into Easter. I believe you go deeper into Halloween,
Yeah, I go deep into all of them,
right?
and I also go deep into different Christmas
Oh,
traditions,
yeah. I
like
think
looking
I've
at the
heard.
origin of the Christmas tree,
Yeah.
mistletoe. None of it goes
hmm
back to paganism.
Okay. Yeah. And so again, that's where a lot of my education on this has come from is through your channel. So and other interviews that you've done. So again, everyone, if you're really like stuck on a specific holiday or specific like component aspect of a holiday, we'll link some other resources that you know where to go find it. But I wanted to kind of go a little bit deeper again to begin with on this whole like sort of philosophy of celebration thing, because here's what I've noticed. And it's kind of been an area where I had to camp out here for a while myself in my own healing and rebuilding, kind of figuring out what do I believe, why do I believe it, how can I use scripture, what is it telling me, and how is that going to lead me? And so on my journey, I came from an environment, and I know a lot of people in our audience are going to resonate with this, so that's why I want to talk about it. I came from an environment where this is going to sound ridiculous, but basically joy was a problem. Celebrating was a problem, being happy and having a good time. And it didn't really matter if it was unto the Lord. It was supposed to be about the suffering. It was supposed to be about the weight of our times. It was supposed to be about making sure that we were going to be saved and we were checking all the boxes and keeping ourselves safe. And so this can be a way bigger, as like a way broader, as well as a way deeper issue than just, is it pagan worship to decorate my Christmas tree and have that in the house? Now, again, we're going to touch on some of that, but I think there's more going on here sometimes and what people have been raised with. And so when we're looking at these authoritarian groups, we're looking at these like workspace groups. Sometimes those oftentimes those go together. People are categorizing, celebrations as idolatrous or pagan. But in addition to that, they're really struggling with being able to celebrate it all and expressing joy. And I want to bring scripture into this. And Michael, I'll pause if you want to jump in and if you have a comment first. But then I have some scriptures pulled that I want to use and have us just dialogue about for a few minutes.
Yeah, well, I'll just briefly say that this is just a fundamentalist, legalist mentality. Uh, I think it starts with this. It starts with a seed of like, I need to be holy for God, which is a good thing, but it can often go off in the wrong directions. Like we see with the Pharisees in the Gospels, they were trying so good to be holy before God, they were rejecting the weightier matters of the law, like justice and mercy and helping others. And they start to, when you go through that mentality, you start to feel better than people that are not as perceived as holy as you. So you start to look down upon them, and then you start to think, well, I have to take all of this very serious because my walk with the Lord is serious. What he did is very serious. Therefore, all this ideas about joy, about having fun, they could be temptations that could lead me away from focusing on being holy and lead me into sin. It starts off with just going to a party. The next thing you know, you're drinking and getting drunk and doing all sorts of horrible things, which is nonsense. But this is the mentality you're going to see in this fundamentalist mindset. I think it comes from that kind of place, this hatred of joy. Starts off with a desire to want to be holy, but it forgets that being holy is just one aspect of being human. Jesus' first miracle was turning water into wine at his wedding celebration. Jesus was not a killjoy. He was very much, I've come to give you life so that you may have it abundantly. He talked about him being the bridegroom, and we are to feast and celebrate when the bridegroom is there. So the idea that fun or joy is anti-Christianity is nonsense. It does come from the fundamentalist mentality, which stirs up in multiple religious views, not just Christianity. But it needs to be recognized for what it is and how it moves one away from the gospel very slowly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. It does come from that legalist background. And I've seen these, jokes about how it says FUN, fun is the beginning of fundamentalist because they really do not go together. Being a fundamentalist is not
Mm-hmm.
fun. So, and yeah, it's very fear-based, right? And that's what you're speaking to, is it's this fear of like, I'm gonna miss out on my salvation. I have to be something. I have to achieve something. And the reality is, I cannot make myself holy and I cannot make myself righteous. My holiness and my righteousness comes through the death of Jesus Christ and his resurrection and what the Lord has done for me. I mean, that's where I get these blessings. That's how I receive them. Does that mean that I milk grace? Of course not. Now we're swinging too far in the other direction. But I can't achieve this. And also, do I need to? Am I being asked to? Are these the rules that are still in the new, if you're like, okay, what am I still not supposed to do? What does it look like to love the Lord my God with all of my everything, my whole self, including my mind? And so if I'm looking at this, is it a problem then if I'm celebrating the holidays? And so again, staying more big picture for a minute, I want to bring in some passages that I'm pulling from the Old Testament on purpose here. And the reason I'm doing it is because oftentimes when we're talking about fundamentalists and we're talking about that legalistic side, there can be a hyper focus on the Old Testament. And I want to say it with this disclaimer. I love the Old Testament. That was more so my focus for my seminary degree. I have such an appreciation and love for the Old Testament. So I'm not saying this to like be dismissive of it. We should be reading the Old Testament and gleaning from the Old Testament. But people can hyper focus on, the law and aspects of the law in the Old Testament. So that's why I want to camp out here for a second. I'm going to pull a few examples because God instructed his people very early on in the Old Testament to set aside different timeframes that created a rhythm for celebrations, for remembrance and for glorifying him and worshiping him. And that's an aspect. It's very important. I think it's central in its core, especially when we're talking about, maybe not if we're talking about Valentine's Day, but when we're talking about Christmas, we're talking about Easter. This is core in these celebrations, is this remembrance and this worship of him. And so I want to give some examples, and I'll read through these pretty quickly. And feel free to pause, please, if you're watching this, and look them up for yourself and check these. Exodus 12:14. This is a day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. This is in regards to Passover. Exodus 23:16. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. Exodus 34:22. Celebrate the festival of weeks with the first fruits of the wheat harvest and the festival of ingathering at the turn of the year. So now we're up to 4 festivals already. Moving into Isaiah 25:6-8, a prophecy for the celebration to come. So we're talking about in the future. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. So this again is talking about when we're looking ahead to Jesus's return. And here's my favorite passage on this topic because it really touches everything. So bear with me. It's a little bit long. I'm going to add a couple comments as I go. This is in Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 14:22-27. Be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks, which were considered to be the best. And the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. Revere meaning to have a deep respect or admiration for. But if that place is too distant and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away. So basically, you've been so blessed, you literally cannot travel with one tenth of what you've been provided with over the previous year. You are then to exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. There, use the silver to buy whatever you like: cattle, sheep, wine, other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice, because he is the honored host here. He has provided for all of this. And then it says, do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. So all are invited and included in the celebration. So when I look at this and I'm comparing this to this constant focus, within some spheres on everything always being hard or everything being works-based, sort of this heart posture of gratitude and thanksgiving that includes enjoyment of God's great gifts. I'm like, where on earth did this come from? I mean, this is what people were told to do. And in the Old Testament, when there was the law and stuff was considered to be, more difficult than our lives here on the other side of Jesus's first coming. It just really, again, it really struck me when I first was doing my deep dive kind of into this a few years ago for myself of like, what do I believe about celebrating? What do I believe about gathering with people? And looking back again at the testament that was used to basically put me in a straitjacket has verses like this. I just think it's really incredible.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting aspects is that God is going to know that fundamentalism or legalism will come out of any religious tradition. So I think it's insightful that he puts verses to remind people to celebrate and have fun in there, because let's just admit it needs commanded to some people because they don't know how to and they don't think it's important. So I think those are important aspects of the scriptures to remind people that it's not all just about approaching God and being very serious. There are other aspects of humanity, like enjoyment and having fun, that need to be accepted and celebrated. And holidays are a good time to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, like along with beauty and humor and knowing that all of these good things came from the Lord. And again, as I'm looking at these festivals that I just read through, there's a core fundamental, I'll go ahead and use this word. There's a core fundamental focus on we're doing it because of God and we're doing it with God and we're doing it for God. We get to enjoy it. We can have a good time, buy whatever fermented drink, enjoy yourself, eat the good food, save, you get to share in it. But you're looking at the bounty of God's provision and you're doing this in gratitude and thanksgiving. And I think that's where maybe some people kind of get fearful if they look at how maybe Christmas is celebrated today. Is I think you mentioned this kind of when we first started talking, sort of this risk of, well, then I'll sin because then I'll do this or I'll do this and I'll do this. Well, maybe someone would. Maybe someone would get away from what the point is or the purpose is. But we can just know that and we can keep ourselves in check. And we've got friends and family, and we have, hopefully a greater community in the body of Christ. And I don't see that we need to, I hate this saying, but it's what's coming to mind at the moment: throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're at risk of sinning in all ways, pretty much at all times. We're human, and that's a possibility. That doesn't mean that we take ourselves out, right? It means that we have our spiritual practices and we seek the Lord's guidance and we have a community again for accountability and we have a repentance and we have grace and we have. I'm going to go ahead and pause and hand it back over to you. I'm like, we don't need to get rid of the whole thing because we're afraid that maybe we'll look like secular people celebrating Christmas.
Well, what's wrong with looking like secular people in some ways? We are of the same culture. We're going to. If you try so hard to get yourself out of the culture, you can't witness to the culture because you're so far removed from it. Paul said, like those under the law, I become like one under the law. Like the circumcised, I become like the circumcised. Paul clearly was about adjusting himself so that he could be a better witness to people. And fundamentalists often care they often don't care about that. They just care about themselves and trying to make themselves super holy, and everyone should be like them. And if they're not, well, that's their own fault. And so it's not very helpful. And again, it's like Jesus said, you're so focused on your own purity, your own holiness, you rejected the weightier matters of the law. Uh, Modern Christians do that. They're so focused on these little things like, well, how am I dressed? What am I doing on the weekend? Am I not having fun to prevent myself from sinning? They've rejected the weightier matters of the gospel. They're not doing the Great Commission. They're not actually out loving their neighbor. They just care about themselves and trying to get themselves super holy. So they are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, which, as we know, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. If you're trying to make yourself first, you're not going to get there. So I think it's just one of those big ironies with these people is that they think they're doing what God wants, and they really aren't. They're moving themselves further away from the culture, and so they're not actually being good witnesses. I always hear the phrase from fundamentalists, we're set apart. We're supposed to be set apart. We can't drink alcohol because we're supposed to be set apart. We can't celebrate Christmas because we're supposed to be set apart, which isn't in the Bible. And anytime a fundamentalist says we're supposed to be set apart, I always ask how. How are we supposed to be set apart? Because you're just making some arbitrary rule on how we're supposed to be set apart that isn't in the Bible. So how are we supposed to be set apart? Well, the only way I can find in the Bible is that we are supposed to be set apart by how we love one another. Jesus said, they will know that you're my disciples by how you love. That's how we're supposed to be set apart, because we go above and beyond to love others. We don't go above and beyond in arbitrary rituals we've created, or we avoid holidays, or we avoid anything that might look secular. We are set apart by how we love. So a fundamentalist loves to say we're to be set apart, but they've never thought about what Jesus meant by that. They just say it almost like a broken record without thinking.
That was so well put. And note to self to go back and pull that as a clip, because that needs to be a standalone clip. Thank you. Yes, that was incredibly well put. I know you and I have both heard so many times that, these specific elements of traditional celebrations are pagan. And so focusing in more on Christmas, because it's the time of year that we're releasing this, I know we've spoken to already, like there is not truth to this claim, but would you mind going through a few of the main issues that people bring up? Like, say, if we start with the date, I would love to touch on the Christmas tree as well, but let's start with the time of year.
Yeah, so people tend to assume there was some sort of pagan holiday on December 25th. And then as the Roman Empire was Christianizing, they took this pagan holiday and just turned it into a Christian holiday, changed the focus from some pagan god to Jesus. The only problem is there's just no evidence of that. Saturnalia is a common holiday brought up, but that was on December 17th, according to early authors like Macrobius in his book on Saturnalia. And it lasted for anywhere between 3 days to 7 days, depending on the time period. So if it starts on December 17th, the longest it can go would be December 23rd. No evidence it was ever celebrated on December 25th. Some will say, well, the winter solstice in the Julian calendar was December 25th, and that was a Roman holiday. That's only partially true. Yes, it was the winter solstice, but there's no evidence of a holiday on December 25th. They just marked it as a celestial event and didn't have any holidays on it. You look in the early fasti inscriptions or early calendars, you'll see that. No evidence of any winter solstice holiday. Some will try to bring up things like Sol Invictus. And Sol Invictus was on December 25th. After Constantine, not until 354 AD, does any calendar mention Sol Invictus on December 25th. During the time period of Constantine and Licinius, sun worship was in late November. Earlier, the Emperor Aurelian worshipped the sun with chariot races every 4 years in October. And we have, again, no evidence of Sol Invictus on December 25th prior to Constantine. And what that tells me is after the Christians got control and were celebrating Christmas, the pagans moved sun worship to December 25th to compete with this new religion that was taking over the empire. So after Constantine, we see a plethora of sources mentioning pagan holidays on December 25th. It just conveniently, there's none prior. So that tells me that, no, it was actually the pagans that tried to take over the Christian holiday, not the other way around. Some will bring up Yule, but there's no evidence that any Christian knew of Yule in its early formation, because Yule was being celebrated in northern Scandinavia, not in the Roman Empire. And even like the historian Snorri Sturluson, who's chronicling the early Icelandic history as well as Norwegian, Scandinavian history, he mentions that King Hakon the Good moved Yule to December 25th to coincide with Christmas. So actually, Yule was moved to December 25th, and that tells us before Christianity came into the area, Yule was not on December 25th. So, there was a lot of proposed holidays, and when you look into the data, nothing's there. The reason Christians picked December 25th as the birthday of Jesus is because they believed that a prophet would die on the same day he was conceived. They believed Jesus died on March 25th. Therefore, that's the day he was conceived. And if you just count forward 9 months, you get December 25th. Case in point.
So, when you're talking about Constantine, do we have evidence for when we think Christmas first started actually being celebrated in comparison to then when all this other movement of holidays began?
So yeah, we believe that Christmas was being celebrated very early on in the church. However, they disagreed on the date. Like I believe Clement of Alexandria placed it sometime in November. He mentions other people believed it was in May. In about the year 200 or so, Hippolytus of Rome calculates that Jesus' birthday would be on December 25th because he calculates the death as March 25th. So again, count forward 9 months. We believe sometime in the 3rd century, Christians started using that date. Thomas Taylor, in his book, The Origins of the Liturgical Year, notes that a group called the Donatists split from the church in the early 4th century, and they kept all their earlier feasts, but they didn't keep later feasts like the Feast of Epiphany. And so that's important because they celebrated Christmas on December 25th. This tells us before Constantine, in the early 4th century, Christians were celebrating Christmas on December 25th. So therefore, it probably happened sometime in the late 3rd century, maybe mid 3rd century. It was just Christians started using December 25th date and it stuck.
Okay. And I probably should have asked you this earlier, but Michael, for anyone who's listening and just heard you rattle all of that off and is like, okay, but Michael, like, how do you know this? Well, do you mind telling a little bit for our listeners and viewers about what your process was? How did you even get into looking into this stuff? And how do you know?
Yeah, I got into it because I was getting annoyed by fundamentalists saying that we can't celebrate Christmas because it's pagan. So I was originally going to do videos saying, even though it's pagan, that doesn't mean it's a problem because that's not what sin is. Sin is not putting presents under a tree. This is ridiculous, guys. Stop acting like children. But then I started reading books like this, like The Origins of the Liturgical Year by Thomas Taylor, papers by people like Thomas Schmidt, Stephen Hymans, Tanya Gulovich has got a great book on Christmas. And I realized that there was just no evidence any Christmas custom, including the date, goes back to paganism. It was just not the case. So I started looking into it and didn't find any evidence.
Got it. And then moving on to the Christmas tree. This one really gets me because, again, they use Jeremiah. So I'll hand it over to you from there. But when they start using scripture for it, that's when I start getting really upset.
Yeah, that's just nonsense. It shows you they don't really study the Bible. They just look for things in the Bible to fit their conclusion. Jeremiah 10 is not about Christmas trees, and anyone who says it is not a serious person, and they need to check themselves because James says those who teach will be judged more strictly, and they're teaching falsehood. Every single scholar out there, any single commentary you'll find on Jeremiah says that this is about somebody crafting an idol. They go into the woods, they cut down a tree, and then they craft it. Jeremiah says they are like scarecrows. Why? Because they're shaped into the image of a god or human-like thing. They look like a scarecrow. They cannot speak. Okay, Jeremiah is clearly talking about idol crafting here. It's not talking about someone cutting down a pine tree and decorating it. So they're not actually studying the passage. They're just looking for something and running wild with it. The real origin of the Christmas tree is very late. We don't see it mentioned until in Alsace, France, which was a German region at the time, until the 1500s. So very, very late we start getting mentions of Christmas trees being used. And then it was brought into Britain by King Albert Queen Victoria's husband, and then it became kind of famous after that. But it was a German tradition originally. What we think is there's various ideas of where the Christmas tree comes from. Some think Martin Luther, some think it goes back to St. Boniface. The most likely explanation scholars have put forward is that they came from paradise trees. So in the Middle Ages, it was very popular to do plays. And every December 24th, there would be an Adam and Eve play performed because that was the feast day of Adam and Eve. So December 24th, put on a play of Adam and Eve to talk about the story of Eden. And December 24th in Germany, there's not going to be a lot of trees available except for evergreen trees. So they would typically use an evergreen tree and decorate it with apples or cakes or whatever they had available. But of course, you don't let food go to waste. So on Christmas Eve, you could gather around the paradise tree and partake of the fruit and the food that was on it. And so that's the most likely origin of the Christmas tree, is that they just sort of morphed from paradise trees. And I actually think that has a beautiful Christian origin because it's about Christmas is about Jesus coming and restoring fellowship that humans had in Eden. Now we now have fellowship with God. The wrath of God is satisfied, and we can now come back in union. So we can then therefore re-enter Eden symbolically and partake of the fruits there. So I think the Christmas tree representing that and coming from the paradise tree is actually a beautiful Christian story that I think Christians should actually study and celebrate and tell people the beautiful origin of where the Christmas tree mostly comes from, this paradise tree origin. It has nothing to do with paganism. Christians should not be scared of it. They should be using this as a chance to present the gospel. But as I said, fundamentalists don't care about that kind of stuff. They care about trying to make themselves more holy and not doing a good job at it, unfortunately.
Yeah. And gosh, that is so interesting. And something that you, like you said, is beautiful, but that has been turned into something that's not only ugly, but something for people to be fearful of, kind of depending on where they are maybe in the hierarchy. And so I wanted to go back and kind of clarify too what I had said about, when they start using the Bible, I get upset. When I'm saying they, I'm talking about the leaders who are behaving arrogantly and instilling this fear and guiding people in this direction. I'm not talking about people who have been lied to and are genuinely trying to serve the Lord and believe that this is what's required of them to do so. And again, there's a genuine like intent there. I have so many people who come to be emboldened and who bring up this time of year that they're really scared to celebrate the holidays, and that's something I lived. I remember being a kid and I would go to a friend's house around this time of year and I would help bake the cookies and I would actually wrap all of my friends' presents. Her mom hated wrapping gifts. And I think she paid me like a quarter a gift or something like that, but I totally would have done it for free anyway. And I loved wrapping them because like, even though I wasn't going to get any, it was just fun to be a part of it. But inside, I felt like I was bad because I was enjoying it. I'm like, there's something wrong with me. Like, this is bad. Like, I'm bad. I didn't even really have the word sin at that point in my young brain. It was just, no, I'm bad for this. And so I'd feel like I'd have to hide it or, yeah, like I just wasn't good enough before God. And that gets in your head and impacts, your identity as a child of the Lord as you grow up. And so then as an adult, when I left that group and I started, my own seeking journey that I was on, I started celebrating the holiday because it seemed like, yeah, I think this is okay. I wasn't celebrating even though I believed it was wrong. I wouldn't want to do that. But yeah, I'm like, no, I think this is fine. But it took a while for it to emotionally catch up and be like, no, I can really enjoy this versus kind of shutting down a bit or kind of going through it and being like, gosh, yeah, I really hope so. I mean, those thoughts nag at us when we've been indoctrinated with them. So we have a lot of people that we talk with at Be Emboldened who are in a similar place. And I encourage them like, hey, hold off if you really think it's wrong. Look into it more. Go on that kind of discovery, do the exploration, figure that out, ask the important questions. And I'm prayerfully, though, hoping that they will be able to celebrate because there's so much goodness in celebrating too. And ultimately, I want to land us there. But before we go there, I wanted to ask you what you have found or maybe what you think of giving gifts at Christmas. Of course, that's another one that comes up. And I would say more often, I hear that one really connected, not with paganism, but with that secular idea of, oh, this is what non-Christians do is they're giving the gifts. And why would we do that? And why do we give each other's gifts if we're celebrating the birth of Christ? And, it goes on from there. So would you mind sharing your response to this part?
Yeah, this once again just is another way in which it demonstrates that fundamentalists don't study the Bible, they just read it to find whatever they can to fit the conclusion they want. Uh, who gave gifts to Jesus, the wise men, to celebrate his birth? Giving gifts, therefore, isn't pagan. Everyone calm down. So, giving gifts is just something people do. It's not pagan. It's something that every human has done at some point in their life. It's a very common cultural thing because humans are social creatures and we like to trade and we like to give to others because we empathize with others. So that's just a very common thing. Giving gifts is in the Bible. It's literally done in the Bible to celebrate the birth of the Messiah. Why would we not give birth at the celebration of the birth of the Messiah? Doesn't make any sense. So the actual truth of this, though, again, has nothing to do with paganism. If you actually study Latin American cultures, Santa Claus is less prevalent because in those cultures, it's the three wise men that come and deliver gifts to children. So Santa Claus is more centered in Anglo-European, Anglo-American type culture. So there's that. And it actually, uh, we don't see it that prominent in the early parts of Christianity. It seems that people were giving gifts on New Year's Day. Adults would exchange gifts. And there was a custom of giving gifts to children on, I believe it was St. Nicholas Day, which was either December 6th or December 7th. Then in the 1800s, that those practices were kind of dying out, and there was like a revitalization of Christmas, a reconstruction of Christmas, basically. And St. Nicholas was then moved, the gift giving saint was then moved to the Christmas celebration, and gift giving became associated with Christmas. And then America's rise in popularity spread to the rest of the world. And of course, this is what happens. So now you can find throughout history people giving gifts at Easter, at Christmas, All Saints Day, you name it, because that's just what humans do. It's a holiday, we give gifts. I don't see what the problem with that is. But again, fundamentalists don't think. They just go, well, I need to just avoid anything pagan, and this sounds pagan, therefore it is. But it just, use your reason. Like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, and as a mom with a 5-year-old, can it become all about the presents? Yes, it can, but that's a teaching moment, right? That's discipleship. So that's something that we get to teach our son. It's not just about the gifts, it's about celebrating who Jesus is, the fact that he came and, all of this and the gifts that he's given us, of course. And I think that's how I think of the gifts personally. I've heard some other people speak to this, of course, too, but Jesus coming, like it's a gift he's given us that he did this, that he made this choice to come to earth, fully human while also fully divine and live and suffer in the way that he has done for us and to give us this gift. And so when I think about that, I think of the crazy amazing generosity. Yeah, I want to also love my neighbor by giving that out too. It's sort of this pay it forward, like, yeah, I've been blessed and I want to bless and give to others. And I think when I'm reflecting during the Christmas season and during the Easter season, yeah, it further sparks that sense of generosity of wanting to do things for others because I'm so focused on what has been done for me. And do we want that all year long? Yes, but these are good, again, reminders, that remembrance and that, refocusing on worship that we humans need because we are forgetful. And so that's kind of how it makes sense to me as I'm thinking about, gosh, look at what Jesus has done for me. And it just, I want to pour that out and spread it, spread it around as well and give that to others. And I think that's really beautiful. And that is a way that we love one another. And that can be, a fruit that actually makes us be set apart, like you mentioned so beautifully earlier. So with that, Michael, as we're closing out, I'm curious, what benefits do you see from celebrating holidays like Christmas and Easter? Because I have found that I don't think it's just neutral. Like, I really think it's good to celebrate them. And I'm not saying that people have to, but I see such a goodness. I went from, gosh, I'm not supposed to do this. It's scary. It's bad. I'm supposed to be set apart. I'm supposed to be holy in these ways and all of these things to, okay, like it's probably fine, to, no, I think it's really good. And so I'm wondering if this is something you've reflected on and maybe what you would say to those who are genuinely seeking and kind of struggling, like I've mentioned. Like, what about this is worth them looking into more?
Well, for one thing, we have to remember Jesus, again, is not a killjoy. Uh, you're not going to make yourself more special by avoiding holidays. You need to just get that through your head. And a lot of Torah observant Christians, for example, still think that, no, I got to avoid them. Even though they're not pagan, it just isn't really, our thing. It's not, I'm like, well, why? Like, there's nothing wrong with it. What are you doing? Like, and one of the things I sort of warned them is think of the children you're raising. They're going to be raised to think they can't participate in all the fun things their classmates and friends are doing. And that's going to be disheartening for them, and it's going to make them think that Christianity is anti-fun. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is it can be kind of detrimental to the next generation because they're being raised in an environment where they're told to separate from things that are fun and that all their friends enjoy. I've heard Orthodox Jews actually raised in America make the same point, where they feel like they were growing up, they wanted to participate in Christmas, but they couldn't because they were Jewish. And then when they got older, they became secular Jews and they started partaking in Christmas celebrations anyway, because, people like to do joyful and fun things. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. It can be a good thing because there's nothing wrong with it, and it's good for the children. Also, it's a great opportunity to actually preach the gospel. Like, as I mentioned earlier, with the origin of the paradise tree, you can talk about the incarnation. I got a video on my channel called the Lost Message of the Bible, where I present the importance of the Christmas message and how the incarnation is basically one of the big climaxes of Scripture, because it's a restoration of Eden in so many ways. So that's another thing that's good about it, is it can be used to teach and preach the gospel, and it can bring people together. Christmas is a good way to go out and invite people that that are not familiar with church or celebrate Christmas things to Christmas celebrations, where they can be introduced to the church in a good, loving community, and then maybe start attending church and hearing the gospel. So I think avoiding these things can be detrimental in a lot of ways, and there's no reason to avoid them. So why are you doing it? Now, if a Christian insists and says, no, I can't celebrate it, fine. At the end of the day, I don't care. But just know you kind of are, if you're raising children, treading on dangerous grounds in some ways by avoiding these things that are harmless and children are going to enjoy. And so I would be very, very, very cautious if that's the mentality you have of how you're going to raise your own kids. But again, you may know something more that I don't, and that's why you don't partake in Christmas, and you may have all this under control. But I'm just speaking generally here. But at the end of the day, Christians don't have to celebrate Christmas, but there's plenty of good reasons to. There's no evidence of any paganism in it, whether it comes to Yule logs, mistletoe, Santa Claus. None of that goes back to paganism, and anyone who tries to make that case has not done the research.
Yeah, I think kind of to summarize what you had just shared, life can be hard. There is suffering in our lives. I've recently heard you present on the problem of evil, and that's something we, of course, talk about here too. And remembrance is good. Remembering who God is and what He's done for us, being able to celebrate that in a joyful way is good. And being grateful for these gifts and these opportunities that we have to enjoy with people that we love, as well as share with people that are new. These are all good things. And so I agree that when I think about raising my little guy, I want him to see these aspects. And I don't want him to miss out on the joys that are available to us, because again, life can be hard. And so why? Why? What's the reason? I'm going to appreciate the reprieves that the Lord offers to us. I want to enjoy those.